Here. Okay. Okay, so we start. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the 5th meeting of our seminar series dedicated to the philosophy of music. I'm truly happy to have here today Professor Julian Dodd, who is talking to us from the UK. So Julian Dodd, as you may know, is Professor of Philosophy and Head of the School of Philosophy, Religion and History of Science at the University of Leeds. He has published extensively on a variety of subjects in metaphysics, the philosophy of language, Wittgenstein aesthetics, and of course, the philosophy of music. So I want to quote here the 3 books that Julian has written: An Identity Theory of Truth, published with Palgrave in 2000, Works of Music and Essay in Ontology, published by Oxford University Press in 2007, and finally his last book, Being True to Works of Music, also published by Oxford University Press in 2020. You might also find it interesting to know that beyond philosophy, Julian enjoys, of course, listening to music, reading, drinking whiskey, and also riding an Italian bike. So we are very honored for your choice, Julian, and we are free to start. You're free to start. The floor is yours, and I will also put the handout you see on this screen in the chat so that you can all follow. So please, Julian.
Oh, thanks very much, Lisa. It's lovely. Well, I was going to say it's lovely to be here. It's all right to be where I am. It would be even lovelier to be with you in Rome. Thanks very much for inviting me. So this talk is a bit of a cheat, really. I mean, normally I like to do kind of work in progress. This is an overview of work in the past, a book that was written a couple of years ago, and it's been quite interesting to think about it again. But I'm already feeling quite distant from it. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes. In the last sort of year, I've been kind of down a couple of different rabbit holes in philosophy. I've been thinking about that under-researched topic, Wittgenstein on following a rule. And I've been thinking about cultural appropriation. I haven't really been thinking about music at all. So it's kind of quite nice to get back to this though. Okay. One nice thing about this book is it has quite a nice cover. The other nice thing is that it's not too long. Okay, so I'm going to give you a kind of an overview of some of the key ideas that I've had. Stuff that I started thinking about really in about 2012. And it was a paper that eventually came out in the European Journal of Philosophy. I think it's called Performing Works of Music Authentically, which got me thinking about this seriously. So this is about the kind of concepts of authenticity that do and don't govern our practice of performing works of Western classical music. So I should say that this is just about Western classical music. It's not about jazz or pop music or rock or anything like that. So there are a number of authenticities that might be in play here. And in the first part, I'm going to introduce you to some of those authenticities. But I'll start off by kind of introducing the practice of what I'm calling work performance in Western classical music. So a composer composes a work in this tradition by producing a score, typically, that encodes instructions for performing that work accurately. And performers perform it by following, in large part, these instructions. Sometimes they accidentally fail to follow some of the instructions. Sometimes they quite deliberately fail to follow some of those instructions. It seems to me that if they follow sufficient of those instructions, then they count as performing that work. It seems to me that work performance in this kind of music, Western classical music, is what I call strongly work focused, unlike, for example, jazz. Just a quick remark in parentheses, WCM, Western classical music. In a previous version of this talk, I called it Western art music and it came out as WHAM. And that led to a certain amount of confusion with, that legendary 1980s pop group. So this is Western classical music, strongly work focused. And what I think is that the work is valued for its own sake. And it's not simply something which gets us to kind of go in for improvisatory music making in the moment. It's not just a springboard for music making in the moment. Rather, we're interested in the work for its own sake. We can only apprehend and so properly appreciate the work through performances of it. And so performances of the work are valued, at least in part, for the way in which they present the work. So what we're doing is we're performing these works with a view to presenting these works in performance. And that's, as well, the main point of performance. That's what, how we value these performances. Unlike, say, Coltrane's rendition of My Favorite Things, we're not really interested with any, really in any light that Coltrane might shed on that particular song. We're more interested in what he does with that rather limited musical material in the moment. Western classical music isn't really like that. We're interested in the works and we're interested in the performances for the way in which they present those works. Indeed, it seems to me that perhaps the ultimate compliment you can give a performance of a work is to say that it's revelatory of the work. It brings to light something that maybe other performers have missed, other interpreters have missed. Okay. Something that my old friend Stefano Pradelli has said is that works essentially invite interpretation in their performance. That's to say that performers aren't just, as it were, deliverers of the work. They're not, as it were, sonic postmen, but they're sense makers of the work. And they kind of shape their performance to present, if things go well, an all-embracing aesthetic vision of that work that evinces an understanding of it, that's somehow rich or deep or insightful or subtle or wide-ranging or whatever. So sometimes, for example, I mean, one way of kind of reading this talk or listening to this talk is to see me kind of in conversation with Stephen Davies. And one thing that, well, occasionally Stephen can sound as if he thinks of performers as kind of sonic postmen and only having to interpret the works to fill in the gaps of scores, right? I don't think of it in that way. So, the works essentially invite interpretation, and the point of performance is to evince that understanding of the work in performance that's rich or deep or insightful or subtle. Performers of works are essentially sense makers of them, right? I'll say much more about this. Okay, so authenticity in work performance. Well, that's going to be a matter of being true to or faithful to something in work performance. And then different accounts of what it is you're being faithful to or true to, and different accounts of that being true to relation will give you different notions of authenticity. Let's distinguish two kinds of authenticity. Work authenticity, which is mainly what I'm concerned with in this talk. Faithfulness to the work in performance, being true to the work, doing the work justice in performance, however you want to say it. So it seems to me there are at least two distinct candidates. A candidate is true to relations when it comes to work authenticity, and I'll get onto those in a minute. Roughly speaking, score compliance, being true to the instructions, and the kind of authenticity that I'm kind of making a bid for, which I call interpretive authenticity, being true to the work by virtue of evincing a profound or subtle understanding of it in performance. So a kind of authenticity, work authenticity, of which I'm distinguishing two kinds. And then there's personal authenticity, and that's gained quite a lot of traction in the literature, largely due to the rather lovely book by Peter Kivy, Authenticities, in 1995. Peter's was very interested in this notion of personal authenticity, where in performance, you're not so much true to the work as true to your own artistic personality, your own individual artistic values, style, and approach. And he thought this was an important norm governing work performance. So on this way of thinking, a performance of a work by someone is personally authentic to the extent that, I'm quoting from Peter here, it's a direct extension, so to say, of the artist's own artistic personality. Or as Bernard Williams might have put it, it's the uninhibited expression or enactment of the performer's individual style. I think one of the things that was great about that book was that it kind of got us to think about different kinds of authenticity that might govern work performance. And I think Peter had a great insight, which was that there's more to authenticity than just being, sort of following the instructions encoded in the score or being true to the performer's intentions. There's something else that looks important. I think what he did was he developed that thought in not quite the right way. So I think that my notion of interpretive authenticity could be badged as being what I view as being the correct way of developing Peter's nascent thought, which is that there's another kind of authenticity. In the book, he calls it another kind of authenticity. So, I mean, I think, for example, that kind of personal authenticity looks very valuable in jazz. It's something that we look for in jazz performances. We like the way that Coltrane inhabits that show tune and turns it into something which is very much his own. That seems to be an important value in jazz. It seems to me to be not an important value, if a value at all, in Western classical music. Okay, are you with me? I'm not asking whether you agree with me, but you're with me, you understand what I'm saying. Right, good. Okay, so turning over the page, let's go back to work authenticity. Let's put personal authenticity to one side and focus on being true to the work in performance. It's fair to say that this notion has been elaborated by analytic philosophers in one particular way, which I've called score compliance authenticity, where being true to the work is construed as following the composer's instructions for performance as these are publicly recorded in the score. And there's a reference to Stephen Davis there. Couple of complications. Not all scored elements are instructions. So in Haydn's Farewell Symphony, I think in the score it says that, toward the very end of the piece, the players are to leave in pairs. And that was a message to Prince Esterhazy that they wanted to go home, right? But I don't regard that as an instruction, as it were. It looks more like a kind of, well, in that case, kind of like a piece of fun, using the score to, using the performance of a work to get a message across to a particular person. Or think of another example of Stevens here. Imagine a composer wrote on a score for a violin concerto that they really wanted the violinist to use a Stradivarius. I think it's questionable whether we'd regard somebody who didn't use a Stradivarius as not obeying the score there, as not obeying a scored instruction. Because I think the conventions of work performance are such that we don't really regard such quasi-instructions as instructions proper. So the first complication is that not all scored elements are instructions. The second complication is that some instructions are encoded only implicitly. So you might have to dig a little deeper to figure out what some instructions for performance are. Some of them aren't written out. I think Peter's own example here is that a Baroque church sonatas movement should be slow, fast, slow, fast. Even if it's not mentioned in the score, that's what you should do. Other features of score compliance authenticity, fairly obvious. It comes in degrees, right? You can be more or less score compliant. But also, I think it's important to recognize it's a normative phenomenon. It is a kind of faithfulness. And that notion of faithfulness is a plainly normative notion. Okay, so that's the normal kind of way that what I've called work authenticity is elaborated in the analytical tradition. And what's more, it's normally given a historicist twist. The assumption is that we'll have to read scores in the context of the conventions, performance conventions and the like that were in place at the time of composition. So for example, you'll have to interpret a Baroque score in terms of Baroque tuning conventions, and the like. That, it seems to me, is a step which is not obvious, giving score compliance the historicist twist. We can talk a bit more about that in Q&A if you want. It seems to be not an obvious move, although most people in the literature make that move very unreflectively. Okay, so there's score compliance authenticity. We kind of all know what that is, right? The kind of faithfulness to the work that I'm very interested in is of a different kind. And I've called it interpretive authenticity. For, you know, in that early paper, I gave it that name. And here, the thought is that one's true to a work, one does it justice by offering an interpretation of it in performance that is such as to evince an understanding of the work. Right? So where understanding the work involves seeing its point, having a sense of why it is as it is. Peter had this lovely expression of having a sense of what makes the music go, is the way he put it, right? Kind of having a sense of the work's overall integrity, having a sense of why the work unfolds as it does, and allowing that understanding to determine how you flesh out the detail of your performance. And I think our critical and appreciative practice does recognize such a norm. We do think that some performances are, you know, perhaps more, you know, kind of more insightful into the work than others. Some performances work against the grain of the work. Other performances kind of bring out that grain. So just to give you an example of my own prejudices, I think Paul Lewis's way with the late Beethoven piano sonatas brings out the grain of the work in a way which, I don't know, Barenboim's don't. Okay. Right. So that's interpretive authenticity. Like score compliance authenticity, it admits of degree. So a performance will be more interpretively authentic the deeper, richer, or more insightful is the interpretation of the work it offers. Okay. Part 3. Focus for a minute on score compliance again. We kind of know what that is, but let's think a little bit more about it and how we value it in performance. So, long conversations I remember with Guy Rawbo about 3 or 4 years ago. I was living in Manchester at the time. He thought I lived in Birmingham. He went to Birmingham. I had to remind him that I lived in Manchester. His response was, well, it's a small place, right? I'll just get another train. Anyway, when he finally made it up to Manchester, we had very interesting conversations about just this topic, as it were, about the normative space that score compliance occupies. And his rather wonderful paper in the AJP, Why Play the Notes, from 2020 is about this topic. So it looks as if score compliance authenticity, unlike many other performance values, and I've given you some examples there, clarity, liveliness, interestingness in interpretation, for example, looks to be valued for its own sake in work performance. Those other performance values seem to inhabit a broadly consequentialist normative space. Sometimes performers think of themselves as trading those values off against each other for the sake of achieving what they take to be a better performance overall. A little bit unclear what that means. I'll say a bit more about that, better performance overall. But it looks as if score compliance doesn't occupy that space. That was Guy's insight. I think it's a really important one. So, the mere fact that disobeying a work's score would make for a more interesting or more original or more lively performance just has no weight in the face of the score itself, right? Within the practice that I'm describing. Departing from the score for reasons such as these, well, it just doesn't present itself as a serious option. Someone says, look, I know Beethoven writes it like this, but I just think it's more interesting to play it like this, or it makes for a more lively performance to play it like this. Someone like that, I guess, we don't take terribly seriously as a performer of the work. So this suggests that score compliance is something of final value in work performance. It doesn't occupy that consequentialist space. So the value here might be final, yet extrinsic, like that attaching perhaps to friendship or to course guards. I love this, gorgeously enameled frying pans. That reveals so much about Christine Korsgaard. All right. So its status as a final value is grounded in the role it plays in our lives. In this case, in the practice of work performance. I mean, actually, I think it turns out that the role that it plays in our lives is, in general, enabling interpretively authentic performances. Right. I'll get onto that. Stephen says more or less that. I forgot my own bullet point, folks. Top of page 4. Right. So score compliance authenticities being a final value is grounded in the fact, and I'm quoting from Stephen here, we are concerned with composers' works and in performances for the light they shed on these. Right? That's why Stephen thinks we value score compliance for its own sake. And I agree with him. But I take that for the light they shed on these works to point in the way of, as it were, interpretive authenticities being the most fundamental value in the practice. I think Stephen's chapter, I think it's chapter 5 of his book, Musical Works and Performances. Oh, look, you can't see it against my background. Is that a metaphor? There we go. Is great. I think that one of the challenges interpreting what's going on in that chapter is that he says a lot of different things about how we value score compliance that I think need to be picked apart. One of the things he says is this thing, that score compliance authenticities being a final value is grounded in the fact that we're concerned with composers' works and in performances for the light they shed on these. That, I think, is a key point. The problem is that it's somewhat buried, I think, in other things he says, which are different. Okay. Let's switch over to interpretive authenticity, this other kind of truthfulness to the work in performance. As the name suggests, it's a critical kind of evaluative feature of performances. Being so crude, but it is, after all, a Friday afternoon, right? I mean, the thing about interpretive authenticity is that it's more difficult to tell, right? How whether the extent to which a performance is interpretively authentic, because you have to apply your kind of critical, aesthetic, appreciative judgment. I mean, if you've got a score and you can understand a score, then you can kind of tell how score compliant a performance is. It's pretty mechanical, not all. Much less so when it comes to interpretive authenticity, because it requires us to have a sense of what is there to be understood in the work, right? What is, as it were, I've described quite loosely as its point. What are the things that make the music go, in Kivi's phrase? And of course, one's judgments on those questions are going to be contested, typically. So that's the point I'm making. I've just made it in a very laborious kind of hand-wavy way. I've said it much more crisply in the first bullet point. What we take to be required for a performance to be an interpretively authentic performance of a work is revealed in our critical and appreciative judgments. So the extent to which we judge that performance to provide an insightful interpretation will depend on what we take the artistically significant features of the work to be and how we rank them comparatively, even informally. I mean, there's no kind of official ranking. It's not like Serie A or anything. So here's an interesting quote from John Barbaroli, which I've used many times on many occasions. It's one of my favorite quotes. It used to take him over 2 years to study the score of a Mahler symphony before he would be ready, as it were, to get his orchestra to start rehearsing it, working through it and getting ready to perform it. And he said this: of course, it doesn't take me 2 years to read these scores, but if you, a real sense of what Barbaroli was like as a man here, I think. But if you prepare for a journey through such immeasurably wide musical spheres, you must know exactly where the musical ideas begin and where they end, and how each fits into the pattern of the whole. Now, here's a bold claim, folks. Those who know a lot more about Mahler than I do will be interested by this. In Mahler's symphonies, there are many highlights, but only one real climax, which one must discover. Here's the crucial bit for me. To do so needs less a simple study of the score than an all-embracing aesthetic vision. So when you're setting out trying to be interpretively authentic, you've got to bring to bear an all-embracing aesthetic vision of the work, a sense of its point, its integrity, as I said before, why it unfolds as it does. And of course, the thing about all-embracing aesthetic visions is that they might be faulty, right? They might have bits that aren't very good, okay? And so it's just going to be much more contested, much more up for debate. And indeed, more than that, it suggests to me that different performers, different interpreters might, by nature of their own, their different artistic characters, shed light on, or as it were, uncover different aspects of the meaning of a work. There might be very different ways of performing it, each of which has something of insight, but which you couldn't, as it were, meld together to make, as it were, the definitively interpretively authentic performance. I'll come back to that. Okay, I've said about score compliance that that's valued for its own sake. The same goes for interpretive authenticity. I said that, someone who said, look, I know that Beethoven writes it this way, but it's more interesting for me if I play it a different way. We don't really, we kind of say, oh dear, no. Maybe going for something else. Something similar applies for interpretive authenticity. So it's not a serious option, I think, to deliberately sacrifice interpretive authenticity for the sake of other performance values. So I said, somewhat kind of playfully, imagine a performer saying, well, it makes less sense of the work this way, I know, but that's how I prefer to play it. That would be a very puzzling thing to say. Performers are sense makers of the works they perform. It looks as if that's a final value. But it seems to me too that interpretive authenticity is a constitutive norm of work performance. It's a norm that arises directly out of the activity's teleology, that of making sense of works for audiences. And interpretive authenticity being a constitutive norm means that it belongs to the very nature of work performance, that its participants both ought to meet and in fact try to meet its demands. Hello, Michael. And this has its origin in the fact that such works are composed in order to be understood, right? Or at least paradigmatic such works are. So interpretive authenticity being a constitutive norm arises out of this teleological fact. It seems to me that the same is not true of score compliance. So, and I think here, Stephen's a little bit hard to follow. I mean, but maybe I'll just resist making a certain criticism and just plow on. I mean, it seems that minimal compliance is a constitutive norm in the sense that to succeed in performing a work at all, you've got to obey enough of the instructions in the work score, at least for the performance to be recognizable as a performance of that work. That's a very Davisian point. But that doesn't mean that score compliance authenticity proper, that's to say the ideal of complying with the score beyond mere minimal compliance, that required to count as performing the work, is a constitutive norm. It isn't. So, while delivering the work, while performing, the work with enough accuracy to deliver the work to the audience is constitutive, accuracy in delivery beyond that is not likewise grounded in the practice's teleology. Seems not. Seems to me that Scruton is exactly right here, although he doesn't elaborate the point. It's kind of dropped in. He says the aim of performance is not merely to produce a particular pattern of pitches, but to present those pitches as music and therefore to make whatever additions and adjustments are required by a musical understanding. Now, that is a very suggestive remark, and I think that his notion of a musical understanding is just my notion. I mean, he can be interpreted as hinting at just my notion of interpretive authenticity. Or at least that's one way of cashing that out. So at this point, it seems to me Davis says the right thing. We wouldn't value score compliance authenticity as we do, that's to say for its own sake, unless in general it leads to a greater appreciation of the works that are played. But I think he doesn't quite see the moral here, which is that what this shows, it seems to me, is that it's interpretive authenticity that's the fundamental performance value, right? We only value score compliance authenticity for its own sake because in general it leads to a greater appreciation of the works that are played. That's what the works are there for, to be appreciated, understood. That's my thought. It occurred to me, looking at all this stuff again, this is just a remark in parentheses, okay? It occurred to me, have I got a very severe view going on here? Does this just reflect my own aesthetic preference? I think there's always a danger when one does this kind of work that is the case. I'll let you decide. Okay. All right then. So, actually, what I'm going to do, I'm going to break for 2 minutes just so people can relax, and then I'm going to start again because I'm roughly over halfway, 60% of the way through. Let's relax for 2 minutes. Okay. Michael, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
How are you?
Yes, I'm all right. And you?
I'm good.
What river are you sitting on?
I'm sitting on the wharf.
The wharf. Oh, the wharf. Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
That is
a spectacularly wet holiday there, one year.
Yes, it's a bit like that at the moment. That's about 5 minutes from my house.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, it's a really lovely place actually. Today the sky is slate grey and very, very watery. Yeah. Oh,
Excellent.
yeah. So I've been kind of saying things. I've been kind of agreeing with you a lot.
I'll try. And...
Yeah. So if there are any difficult questions, you can answer them.
No.
If any of you don't know, I've known Michael for 35 years. He was my first ever teacher in philosophy at Sussex in 1985. Yeah.
Yes. Lucky for me, very lucky.
He did, yeah, kind of, yeah. Showed me how to be a philosopher, but there's only a certain amount you can do, I think, That's what's... Right, shall I carry on?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I've been talking about work authenticity up to now. So what, I hear you ask, about personal authenticity? What about Kivi's big idea? And as I said earlier, what I think about this is that Peter had a real insight, which was that there is this other kind of authenticity governing our practice, but it isn't quite as he elaborated it. So yeah, personal authenticity, the kind of thing that John Coltrane has in spades when he plays, my favorite things. So it seems to me that it's not a performance value in work performance of this kind within this genre. So have a think about two sonically indistinguishable performances of a work that use the same instrumentation. So the first performance, imaginatively titled E1 by A, has what I've called shed loads of personal authenticity. A is true to her own values and tastes and aesthetic intuitions. Performance E2 by B is not personally authentic. He prepares for, well, sure, she prepares for her performance by slavishly following the instructions of an influential mentor, putting her own tastes, values, and intuitions to one side in favor of an approach that's uncharacteristic of her personal style. Sounds just the same as A's performance. It seems to me that if personal authenticity were a performance value, then the first performance, E1, would be a better performance than E2. I mean, it would have one value that the other lacked, or more of it, at least, than the other. Now, this might be where this might be an occasion where my own tastes, preferences, maybe even philosophical theory is driving what I want to say about this case. My thought is that an audience member fully attuned, as I say, to the norms of our practice of listening to performances of works of Western, I've got it Western art music, Western classical music, would regard those two performances as evaluatively equivalent as performances of the work, right? That would seem to show that personal authenticity isn't a performance value. It makes no difference. Right? The difference in personal authenticity in those performances doesn't make an evaluative difference. Objection, someone might think. Appreciating an artwork involves us in appreciating the artist's achievement. It's the view which is very well expressed by Dennis Dutton. A's achievement is greater than B's because A thought her performance through for herself. She did the hard work herself. So her performance is better than B's. That seems to me to miss its target, because performances of works aren't themselves artworks, but interpretive presentations of artworks. They're not intended to articulate an artistic content of their own so much as present and interpret the work performed. Consequently, even if that account of artistic appreciation is true, it doesn't apply to performances of works in this genre. Rather, it seems to me that a performance of a work, qua interpretive presentation of that work, has exclusively work-directed success criteria. That's a rather pretentious way of making my point. Concerning, for example, how accurately the work represents the performance represents the work, and how convincing is its interpretation of that work. It seems to me that an assessment of the performer's achievement doesn't really come into it. I mean, sure, we may think to ourselves, gosh, that was a real achievement by performer A, but it doesn't make her performance any better. Okay, unlike, for example, jazz, I think that, yeah, that doesn't hold for jazz, but it does hold for Western classical music. Okay, so in this, I've been reading a lot of John McDowell. So in a slightly condescending way, I'll give a diagnosis of the sources of the false belief that personal authenticity is a performance value here in this genre. First, the assumption that performances of works are artworks. I just don't think they are for the reasons given. It may be plausible, as Matthew Kieran thinks, to think that an artist expressing her artistic personality in the artwork she produces is a good-making feature of such authorship. But performances are interpretive presentations of artworks, not artworks in themselves. Okay, and so work performance is governed by work-directed norms, not a norm of personal authenticity, it seems to me. And then I think there's a confusion over the nature of performance interpretation, what that involves. And I think this might get to the root of why I think that the insight that Peter has is better elaborated in my kind of a way. Thinking about, you know, roughly speaking, the other authenticity is interpretive authenticity, not personal authenticity. And this is about interpretation, performance interpretation. And I'm going to throw some metaphors around. So it seems to me that the proper aim of interpreting a work in performance is not, as it were, to inhabit the work, as we sometimes say of jazz musicians. You know, he made that show tune his own, right? Sonny Rollins, he just took a show tune from a musical and he's turned it into his own. He uses it to express, to lay out in front of an audience his own artistic personality. That is amazing that he can do that with such meager musical material. But it seems to me that we're not really interested in that in Western classical music. Rather, this could be interpreted as being slightly kind of prissy, what I'm saying here, but it's more about giving oneself over to the work, right? That's what we're interested in. So to speak, it's not, it's not that we think that the work should come to us, or as performers, that the work should come to us. We've got to go to it, right? That's a very crude way of putting it. So it's giving oneself over to the work, performing the work with interpretive authenticity, making sense of that work for what it is, right? That's important. Hence, we have a lot of this, there's a lot of metaphorical talk of transparent performance. So a really wonderful Radio 4 series, Great Lives, actually introduced by somebody with whom I'm having dinner on Saturday night, on Dinu Lipati. Mark Ainley says of Lipati's playing, it's so transparent it almost disappears. Now, that's meant to be a compliment, perhaps the ultimate compliment. Likewise, there's a lovely remark, or kind of lovely bit of writing by Fiona Maddox talking about Mitsuko Uchida playing Schubert, I think. Spare in gesture, supple in action, Mitsuko Uchida does the maximum a musician can to allow composer rather than interpreter to speak. This is a fascinating passage, actually. Yes, it's an illusion. No one works harder to achieve this state of near disappearance. Quite why the next bit follows, I don't know, than the Japanese-born, European-educated, I was always expecting her to say, and 5 feet 3 inches tall, London-based pianist. And while she's vanishing, you can hardly fail to notice her. Her personality is striking. Now, it seems to me that Fiona Maddox is onto something there, and it's roughly speaking the same thing that I think Kivi's onto, but it needs carefuler handling, all right? And that's what I'm going to try and do. So it seems to me, and it's about the role that one's artistic personality plays in interpretation. Kivi's thought is that in interpretation, one just, as it were, and I'm sounding very Californian, kind of lets it all hang out. Well, one aims at laying out your artistic personality for the audience. That, it seems to me, is not right, although one's artistic personality is, of course, involved, as Maddox is suggesting in this passage. Rather, what's crucial is, first of all, that one is not just using the music as a way to display or elaborate or work through one's own artistic personality, or one's own musical personality, but one is, as Bob Sharp puts it, trying to understand the work for what it is. And Bob says, in his typically trenchant style, I should not use a work of art for my own gratification any more than I should use a person for my own gratification. That's classic Bob. So first of all, it seems to me that somebody who thinks that personal authenticity is a value here has misunderstood that point. But it's nonetheless onto something important, which is that one's musical personality as a performer will be involved and indeed will be displayed. But it's the purpose of that is crucial to get right. So here's what I think. So a performer's interpretation of the work in her performance will inevitably reflect her artistic personality. And as Maddox points out, our experience of her performance will essentially involve an awareness of her artistic personality. So talk of disappearance and transparency, though kind of well-intentioned, aren't quite right, because you haven't got transparency here. Rather, The proper role of A's artistic personality, the performance artistic personality, is just that of eliciting understanding of the work. And that, I think, is what Maddox is trying to say, right? You're aware of her personality in making sense of the work. Talk of transparency can kind of make you think that you're, as it were, that there's no kind of interpretation going on, that you're just a cipher as a performer. And of course you're not. And you're aware of the personality involved in the making sense of the work. So, while the expression of the performer's artistic personality in her performance is not itself a performance value, the insight that she sheds on the work will inevitably be expedited by her artistic personality. And one will be aware of that as one enjoys the performance and gets some of the insight. Okay then. So I think that it's not handling that point with sufficient care that makes it look as if personal authenticity is itself a value. It isn't. It's kind of misunderstanding the place of one's artistic or musical personality in interpretation that makes it seem as if it is. Okay, getting towards the end. Score compliance authenticity and interpretive authenticity are both valued for their own sake, it seems to me, but they can come into conflict. And this is where it gets interesting. And yet we now know, I'm being optimistic here, we know that it's interpretive authenticity that's the fundamental value. So it looks as if on the occasions when such conflict occurs, in the abstract as it were, performers should aim to sacrifice score compliance for interpretive authenticity. Where there's a conflict, the interpretive authenticity trumps the mere score compliance. And so there are some examples of this I talk about in the book. They're all controversial, of course, of their nature. I'll just say this. I don't think a promising way of trying to, of replying to the kind of view I have is to try and take issue with the examples piecemeal. I don't think, because I just think, you know, my reply is going to be, just think of some other examples. There are tons of them. You know, so I might quibble about metronome markings in Beethoven, et cetera, et cetera. And I just think that basically this way of thinking of it makes sense of many of the predicaments that musicians find themselves in. So what I'm trying to do in laying this out is to try and describe, or give a theoretical representation, if you like, of the situations that performers find themselves in and the decisions that they make and why they make them. Okay, so Alfred Brendel, another fabulous quote. I mean, what a brilliant pianist and what a brilliant writer about music. Metronome marks in the hammer clavier. Here's what he says. In the first movement particularly, the prescribed tempo cannot be attained or even approached on any instrument in the world by any player at all, be he the devil incarnate, right, without a grievous loss of dynamics, color, and clarity. He goes on to say, just don't try it. Don't do it, folks. Don't play at that tempo because you lose everything that matters for Beethoven's music if you try. So he thinks that dynamics, color, clarity are crucial for making sense of Beethoven's music in performance. If you follow that scored instruction, you lose all that. You lose sight of what makes the music go. Don't do it. Disobey the score. Okay. Another example given to me by Mark Evan Bonds, the recapitulation in the first movement of Beethoven 5. There's a fanfare-like motif. In the recapitulation, when we change key, the valveless horns couldn't really hit those notes, obviously. It looks as if Beethoven gave that motif in the recapitulation to the bassoons. Some people think this, and it's a defensible view. They think, look, it's meant to be a fanfare. It's meant to be kind of telling us that something important's going to happen. Lovely lyrical bit in the strings is coming up. Bassoons aren't terribly fanfare-y. So given that we have nice valved horns nowadays, give it to the valved horns. Disobey that bit of the score. It makes better sense of what the fanfares that, what that motif is there for. Certainly Karajan does that. And Evan Bond said to me that when he first heard a performance where it was played on the bassoons, he just burst out laughing. Right? It just sounded so wrong to him. That's a defensible view. Okay, so that might be another case where someone might think, on the basis of wanting to maximize interpretive authenticity, making sense of the work, in particular making sense of that particular fanfare, no, we'll disobey, we'll disobey that scored instruction. And then there's something a bit wilder. I was pointed in this direction by John Irving, the forte pianist. Steyer's performance of the Rondo alla Turca. In the liner notes, it says this. I mean, he does all kinds of wild things, melody transferred to the bass line. It's kind of, he doesn't just kind of leave a few things out, add a few things. It's completely kind of played with in order to kind of bring out what he thinks is the important feature of the music, its puckishness, its playfulness, its capacity to surprise. In the liner notes, it says this: because of the movement's ubiquity, Steyer chose to change the ornamentation and even the lines of the music so that it's quite different from Mozart's original, but is in keeping with Mozart's compositional style. In other words, he improvised a new twist on a classic, as Mozart was known to have done. It has a wonderfully fresh, exciting sound to it, not just because it's unexpected, but also because Steyer does things that Mozart didn't usually do in his sonatas, such as moving the entire melody to the bass line with sprightly punctuation to the right hand, or creating counter melodies that almost relegate the theme to an accompaniment. And you might think he's kind of doing a fantasia on the rondo here, or something along those lines, but it's it's certainly badged in the recording as the rondo. Seems to me that he's deciding to depart, on face value, he's departing from the score for the sake of getting across the music's point, which is to kind of privilege interpretive authenticity over score compliance. Okay, what I'll do is I'll end, as every paper here should, with a brief response to Stephen Davis. So I don't think that Stephen really sees the possibility, or at least when he wrote this, which is a long time ago, he didn't really see the possibility of a position like the one I've elaborated. So he imagines a case where performers might decide to depart from the score for the sake of interestingness. And he says, that's just very wrong. There's a long quote there. That a performer should deliberately depart from a scored instruction that she could obey is an odd recommendation indeed. It always makes me laugh for some reason, this bit. It's one thing to play wrong notes accidentally, and quite another, it's kind of quite I'm doing a kind of headmasterly tone, quite another to play wrong notes deliberately for the sake of achieving an interesting interpretation. And will you see me in my office after assembly? I want to kind of add to that. The recommendation is strange because it sets the player's intention at odds with the goal of work performance. The goal of work performance, which it looks as if it's accurate delivery, according to Stephen. Though the musician represents himself as playing the work, indeed as offering an interesting interpretation of it, he intends to ignore some of the composer's work determinative prescriptions. It's as if this performer doesn't understand what work performance is. He's like the chess player who knows all the moves, but doesn't understand that the aim of the game is to capture his opponent's king. He misses the point of the enterprise, and in that respect is not playing the game. So it seems to me that interestingness isn't the issue here. It's the interesting cases that we need to, I think, make sense of and describe correctly, at least, are those in which performers are pulled in two different directions, by two different ways of being true to the work. There's obeying the score, and then there's playing the music in a way which does it justice, which kind of expresses an understanding, a better understanding of what makes the music go, right, of its overall integrity. And it seems to me that plenty of performers find themselves in that predicament. And that what they do oftentimes is compromise score compliance, not for the sake of mere interestingness, but for the sake of this other kind of justice, doing justice to the work, this other kind of authenticity. And it seems to me that that just is to play the game. So what I think I've done here is actually describe, in a way, it's a bit of practical philosophy. I think I've kind of described the sorts of binds that musicians find themselves in and the basis for why many of them make the decisions that they do. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. So I think we can, if you want to rest for 1 minute, I don't know. I mean, I found it a nice idea. Yeah, maybe you want to drink some water. And we give people time to think
Or even
what they want to ask. You can just raise your hand or write question in the chat if you. What is that? Whiskey you're drinking? Wow. Okay.
I better have Perrier.
Yeah. So you can ask question by raising your hand. You find it somewhere below, or you just write question in the chat, and then maybe it's easier for us to follow. So I'll put it here.
Right, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, okay. Fine. Okay, so I see already 2 questions. The first one from Elisa and the second one from Chiara. So when you're ready, we can start with the Q&A. Oh, wow. You're drinking here. Nice. Okay, so Elisa, I think you can.
Friday night. Yeah.
Okay. So this is just a small marginal question, I think. So at some point, you compared the case of, say, the master, who is a performer, who gives a very effective interpretation of a work, and of the pupil, so to speak, who simply follows the lesson of the master. And you said, well, both performances are equally valuable in my view. And I was wondering, does your view also admit of unaware performers of extremely good performances? Like people who have not, thought about the fact that they are interpreters of a work, but for some reason happen to offer a performance that is perfectly indiscernible from a performance that we would value incredibly good.
Yeah, in theory, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to rule it out. I mean, some performance interpreters come at it in a very cerebral way, and others can be much more sort of intuitive. So it can happen that someone can be quite unreflective, I guess, and come up with a performance interpretation that is really convincing, and may not even be able to say much about it in conversation afterwards. I think that can happen, yeah. Does that sound right to you, Elisa?
It does. Yeah, I want to apply it to other art forms, but this is matter for another conversation.
Yeah. Thanks. Were you next, Lisa?
I think Chiara is next.
Oh, Chiara's next.
Yeah.
Thank you, Julian, for your inspiring talk. I want to ask you, in relation to the last part of your book, how do you reconcile extreme Platonism with your thesis that musical works have meaning, as in the case of Mahler's First Symphony, which has meaning regarding to the death of children? I mean, can a sempiternal entity have such historically determined content? I mean, what is a type without meaning if this meaning is part of the process, compositional process?
Right. So, okay, that's a really nice question. It's a sort of question I really, this explains why it's such a good question. The kind of question I really hate.
I know.
Thanks very much. So I think that meaning properties will be relational. So they'll be taken on by the sempiternal type in time. Right. So I don't think that the meaning, you know, I don't think that the meanings of works of music or any other art are, as it were, to be read off from the artist's intentions.
Okay.
Was that a presumption of your question? Sorry, I may be being very slow.
Yeah, but I want to understand, what do you mean for type without this? What is your type? So the type that you mean?
The type. So I mean, so in that book in 2007, it was a type of sound sequence occurrence.
Okay, but if this meaning belongs to the compositional process, I think you, I mean, this is a bit in contrast with the extreme Platonism. Let me think that you, I don't know, you are thinking another ontological position, that you have in mind another ontological model. I don't know.
Well, Walter Storff said something like this about aesthetic properties, didn't he, and artistic properties, that the same sempiternal type can be, I don't know, exciting as composed by Brahms and unexciting as composed by a composer 100 years later. Think of meaning properties a bit like that.
Okay.
Yeah? So there'll be relations between times and people, maybe. So the type will be a pure sonic type, but its meaning properties, like according to Walter Storff, its artistic properties will be, as it were, relational in that way.
Okay.
I mean, that it seems to me is a promising way around the objection, which goes, Julian, how can what you're saying now be rendered compatible with what you said in 2007 about works of music?
Yeah, because now
it's a promising way around it, but there's a sense in which it really is the case that I'm kind of less bothered about defending that than I was in 2007.
Okay.
But that's a very good question. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a question from Alessandro Bertinetto, who had to leave, but he sent me his question, so maybe you want to try to respond to it, and then I will tell him, or he can just listen to the recording. So he asked, again, about the meaning of the work. So he asked, what is the meaning of the work and how musicians can grasp it and how recipients grasp it? According to, I think, Coltrane is able to grasp the authentic meaning of my favorite things while playing it in a very creative way. Right. So yeah, that's what he asks.
Okay. So what I want to say about that is that's and I would say this if Alessandro were here. I don't think that's a particularly helpful example, because I mean, I just don't think it's true that what Coltrane does when he plays My Favorite Things is bring out the meaning in any sense of that song. I think that he's just using it as a framework for improvisation. I don't think, I mean, does anyone think that what he's doing is uncovering what that, as it were, what that song is really about? I mean, the interest in what he's doing, it seems to me, is that he's taking something so banal and turning it into something so different and indeed reflective of his own personality. It seems to me he's not really in the meaning business. Or if he is, it's just to, as it were, take something with a banal sort of meaning and turn it into a performance with a very different meaning. So that's kind of part of what I was trying to, and I was trying to distinguish between, I mean, you might think that jazz performers perform works, but if they do, they're doing something very different to what Western classical performers are doing. They're not in the interpretation of the work business, bringing out the meaning of the work, so much as using it as the springboard for music making in the moment, in their own style.
Okay, so other questions? Otherwise, I will go. Yeah, Michael, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can. You can. Yes, good. This is, I'm totally lost here, Julian. So this is not really clever enough to be a criticism, even.
Yeah.
It's just that my feelings about personal authenticity, or the thing called personal authenticity, aren't quite the same as yours. So my inclination is to think that that actually there is something worse about the performance of the kind of mimic than the performance of an authentic performer. So I mean, I haven't actually done it, but I thought I would this year learn what the hell's the thing called? Schumann song cycle, you know, the famous song cycle, which begins with May. Anyway, yeah, forgotten this damn name. Anyway, and I listened to a recording by Gérard Souzet, lovely French light baritone, and I was immediately aware I couldn't sing it like that. Well, I could kind of do a pastiche, but I couldn't. And I think that I wouldn't properly have done it. I wouldn't have done it right if I'd done that. And it's not because, and it's very difficult to work out exactly why, but my inclination is to say that if I haven't really worked through to a way of doing it that's really properly for myself, I haven't really understood it. So my inclination is not to say that these things that that people talk about as personal authenticity don't really count as a relevant value, but they're part of what it is to understand the work properly. But that's really rubbishly put. But that's how it feels to me. And similarly, I was listening to it as a load of different recordings of Op. 110, Beethoven's penultimate piano sonata. And as you know, and there's one that I won't mention by name, but the pianist in question always seems to me to be putting on an act, and that feels like they haven't got to the bottom of it. But that's right. You didn't put that rubbishly at all. It's really rich, all of it. I mean, I don't want to belittle the achievement of the person who thinks it through for themselves. I mean, there's a sense in which they're a better performer than so we're imagining two performances that are sonic doppelgangers, and one's been thought through and the other hasn't. Now, it seems to me that the thought through one, I mean, you think hats off to the performer. They really understand it. The performer, B, maybe they don't really, they don't understand it. But it seems to me that their performances both evince, as performances, they evince the same understanding, right? Even though the achievement of one is less than the other, and even though the understanding of one person is less than the other. And sometimes I think it can happen, can't it, that a performer can have this kind of knack
and can give us a performance that evinces great understanding, and yet they can be kind of ingenues. They kind of don't know what they're doing. That can happen, I think. I mean,
yes, I mean, I heard an interview with Ida Hendel in the 70s, and she was asked to explain what was going on in the work, and all she could do was talk about fingering. But you know, it was a really great violinist.
yeah. Or for example, you know, 15 years or so ago, I spent a lot of time listening to very gifted children play classical music. And if you shut your eyes, as it were, you thought, this is an incredibly rich interpretation of this. And they honestly, you know, part of me thought, God knows what's going on there, but personally, they didn't have much of a clue what they were doing. They just had a knack. I mean, do you see what I mean? So you might want to distinguish the understanding of the performer from the understanding their performance evinces.
Yeah, no, yeah.
That might sound really rubbishy.
No. I can hear the point. It doesn't feel quite right, but I don't have a quick argument against it. But yeah, thank you.
No. I mean, you know, I just remember hearing. There's a very talented trombonist at my daughter's school, who is now, well, 18. He was principal trombone in the LSO. And Pete was a bit like that. I mean, he just played everything. I mean, it sounded so deep, but it was like playing football for him.
But maybe it was. That's I don't. I mean, I suppose I don't think I'm not very. I don't know what to think about that kind of thing, because people are often very bad at theorizing their own understanding, their own way of doing things. So that doesn't worry me at all. And it may not be a terribly intellectualized approach that they have anyway, and that's also fine. It just seems to me that it's a question of trying to work out. I mean, here's another way of putting the same question. The question is, I mean, how can it be a good thing in jazz music, if it is that the playing is authentic?
Personally authentic.
Personally authentic, yes. And the thought is, well, I mean, so what is happening in jazz at all that's even a relevant consideration? Because clearly you don't want the idea that the point of this is for the musician to show themselves off, or just to reveal. It's not, you know, the audience isn't there to understand the musician. That's not what they're there for. Even in jazz, whatever. Okay, they're not there to understand the musician. So why does that matter there? And the thought is, well, whatever the reason is for it mattering there, it'd be surprising if it didn't carry across a little bit.
Yeah, no,
where a work also mattered.
I mean, maybe saying that, but in jazz, you definitely want to see what Sonny Rollins does with that tune.
Yeah.
And you want to see what he with his style will do with it. So he's not trying to make sense of the tune. He's just trying, I mean, you want to see, I mean, part of it is about, you know, how will he solve these little musical problems that come up, you know, in real time with this tune, given the style that he has. What will he do? It doesn't seem that there's anything like, I mean, it seems I don't see much of that going over into Western classical music. I mean, obviously people have a style, but the thought, this might be me being too austere again and having one idea and just like hammering it through. But it seems to me that the style is there. The thought is that style is a kind of point of view on the work, such that aspects of its meaning will only be open to that kind of point of view. It's that sort of picture.
Yes.
It's not meant to be an object of consideration in its own right. It's a conduit.
Yeah, I never happy with
conduit. You know, you're aware of it.
No, okay. No, thanks so much.
My conduit talk, do you?
No, thanks so much.
No, that's really good. Really good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so other questions? Otherwise, I will put.
I have a question.
Okay, go on.
I ask in the chat. Julian, at some point you said that an interpreter of classical music is really not an artist because it's more a trade union between the work of art and the audience or something like that. But now take the case of Wynton Marsalis playing Bach, okay? He's not an artist then, it's just, you know, the trade union. But then as a bass, he plays jazz. And so at that point, he becomes an artist because he's not, so it seems strange that, you know, Wynton Marsalis is an artist or not an artist, depending on what kind of music he's playing. About that.
I mean, I'm quite happy to use the phrase performing artist for a musician. I think what I was interested in was the question of whether performances are artworks.
So not even as a jazz player, they would be doing an artwork?
Well, about jazz, I mean, jazz is, I mean, Jerry knows that he's forgotten more about jazz than I've ever known. But I mean, I'm not sure what the works in jazz are. It's a bit of a difficult question. I mean, and also, I mean, think about, and now I'm going off piece. It's a difficult meta question, how you decide what the artwork in a genre is.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, people say occasionally, oh, it's that which is the primary object of critical appreciation or whatnot. And then you start thinking about, you know, art forms, and often there's more than one object of critical appreciation. You know, jazz, for example, you compare, you know, what you're interested in is what Coltrane does in performance with that song. So you're kind of, so yeah. But I think that I wouldn't say. I think the point I was trying to make wasn't really so much about the concept artist, but artwork. So I think of an artwork as being something which is intended to have its own, as it were, self-standing artistic content, whereas I think of performances of works of music as being interpretations of artwork. But no, thanks for the question. That was really nice. Jazz is really difficult, I think.
I see another question from Elisa. She wants to ask you.
Again, just a curiosity. So do you think that the issue of, so the very relationship between the author of the work and the interpreter can be thematized in a work by the author? Like, for instance, do you think that an author can produce a work that deliberately makes it difficult for the interpreter to perform it in a way that is simply faithful to the work, to perform it in a way that leaves their personality aside, so to speak?
So you're
Michael is laughing.
Have you got an example?
No, I don't have an example. I'm just thinking.
So it's a case where the work is composed in such a way that it's very difficult to perform.
That it is very difficult to perform it faithfully, in your sense of faithfulness, because the work brings the interpreter to, you know, take a very personal,
I see.
approach but it is like it's like a trap.
Good. So the work would be one which instructed performers to bring to bear their artistic personality.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. But of course, playing the work with understanding would require one to do just that. So in a sense, playing with personal authenticity, right, would be a way of playing with interpretive authenticity.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, maybe something like that is going on in cadenzas.
You have to explain this to me.
If you approach a cadenza in the a cadenza in the way that you should. I mean, now of course everyone just, it's scandalous. Everyone just learns them, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That's a really nice question. Yeah. But I think there, I think I'm right. I think there the personal authenticity would be in the service of playing the work with understanding. Yeah.
Okay, so other questions? Otherwise, again, I will ask you something.
Before you do, can I just say, Lisa wrote a review of this book.
You read it?
I've read it, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Really good. While it raises some very nice points, and it is a really good review. While I'm about it, if anybody wants to write a review for Mind of my book, the person who was writing it has now withdrawn it in light of my comments. So it was one of these, and Jerry, I wonder if you guess who it is. It's one of these people who kind of found in it what they thought would find rather than what was there.
I think I know. I guess at least. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Apparently, I'm a kind of a very abstract analytical philosopher who wants to do metaphysics all the time, and in fact, this book is chock full of examples. Anyway, but thanks.
I liked it so much. So from my part, really.
But look, if anyone would like to review this book for Mind, contact the reviews editor. That's what I'd say.
Okay.
Lisa, go on. Sorry.
I just want to ask you. I mean, because all this idea of interpretation somehow relies on the concept of being insightful, or being able to be transparent, or to bring about something in the work that is not obvious, or that we can grasp of the work and so on. So who or what determines this insightfulness of an interpretation? Because I mean, in the beginning of the past century, people were used to hear Bach played as Chopin's in a romantic way with pedal and stuff, and people believed this was insightful, I guess, because that was the style. And then things changed, and now we hear those interpretations, and we find them simply completely, they misunderstand the point. They're not Bach. We say, no, it's not possible to play Bach this way. That's really a way to, So the point is, what if there is some sort of objectivity in all this, discourse, or it's just about what, I don't know, the world of art, the world of music decides what's insightful, what's not, what's better, what's,
it's the same problem as there is for aesthetic judgment. It's just an example of that. We do have kind of rough and ready ways of gaining a sense of, of which interpretations are more convincing. We have, a reasonable sense of good judges. We talk to people. Of course, when it comes to, you're absolutely right that, there's disagreement, but I think there's there's kind of a surprising amount of agreement too. Yes, I mean, you can't, as it were, operationalize, you know, I mean, there's no kind of method that you can use to determine what makes for a good interpretation of a piece of music. But it seems to me that we can, you know, experienced listeners to music can begin to gain a sense of that, whilst accepting that, you know, there will be intellectual fashion, there will be a, you know, an element of disagreement, and that's the sense in which I think that it's just a general, it's the same general problem as there is for the objectivity as, you know, the aesthetic judgment, really. Jane, you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, go on. Jane, you have to unmute yourself. Oh, okay.
Good.
Okay.
Okay, Julian, I really enjoyed your talk, and I really liked your notion of performers being sense makers of music. I agree with that completely, and I was very glad to hear that. And I found all of your comments about personal authenticity very interesting. Now, I am a musician, as well as also I work in philosophy. So I come at it, and I am a performer. So here's my question. You talked about interpreters or, you know, performers being sense makers. To what extent and how successfully do you think philosophy of music and philosophers of music like yourself, in particular analytic philosophers of music, to what extent do you think they help in the sense making of music? I know what performers do. I also know what philosophers of music do, and they don't always come together. And sometimes, and I totally admire your abstraction, and I think it's very well done, and I'm glad to see it there. But here's my question. How good are you, and is philosophy of music, how good is it at sense-making music and performance in particular?
Thanks very much, Jane. That's a really good question. So, yeah, I mean, this is always a challenge for philosophy of anything. Yes. Philosophy of physics, philosophy of maths. This is a kind of question that gets pushed. I mean, I don't think that in principle there's a problem. I mean, some people are better at it than others. I also think there are different projects. So there are different ways of coming at music. So for example, my first book was really just a piece of applied metaphysics. And that was, you know, it was quite a kind of analytical philosopher's topic in a way. Yeah. It seems to me that, you know, that was kind of, it's in a sense making sense of music, what musical works are, but in a very kind of, well, in the context of analytic metaphysics. But yeah, but the kind of project this is about, which is about, it's more practical, it's evaluative. And I think that, well, I guess the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? I mean, I think that what I'm trying to do in this book, and you know, I'll let other people decide how well that's gone, is to kind of describe how things are in the practice. So sometimes in philosophy, and now you can tell I've been reading too much Wittgenstein, just describing things in the right kind of way can get you a long way. And in a way, that's what I'm trying to do, is just to kind of, you know, say, here we've got this practice. Let's represent, you know, the various norms governing this practice and try and make best sense of the decisions that musicians make. Somebody who was a great help to me at the very beginning of this was a man called John Irving. I mentioned him in the talk, this kind of forte pianist, harpsichordist. We actually wrote a paper together on this because he thought, now he might have just been buttering me up, right? I mean, but he thought that the way that I described this kind of normative conflict was right. He thought that struck, sorry about this, that struck a chord with him, right? And Other practitioners who I've talked to have said the same thing. So maybe, of course, I'm a philosopher, not a musician. So that means I've got a certain kind of training. I hope I know enough about musical practice. I'm an experienced listener to kind of, go in for that project of making sense of things. I guess that's what's going on in the book. So I think that, in principle, a philosopher can bring a lot. I mean, the book has lots of examples in, I suppose, and I think that thinking about the right way of describing those examples is important. And I think philosophical training is important for that, actually. So that's where the philosophy can come in.
Yes.
That kind of rigor and clarity can maybe give us what I described as a theoretical representation of a practice. That can be enlightening. Bit of a hand-wavy answer, Jane. Sorry about that, but yeah.
No, listen, I thank you very much, and these are huge questions, but are always very interesting, because I'm always struck and have been struck that sometimes, and certainly when I was teaching philosophy, in trying to say to philosophy students, remember, language is a very different thing to the musical language, and they don't always come together. And I think it behoves philosophers of music to always kind of bear that in mind.
I think that's right.
Some of them don't, as I'm sure you agree. Some of them don't, and it looks like they have the answers, and musicians end up going, hey, come on now, it's more complicated than that.
You're right.
You certainly never did that.
So one of the things I think what philosophers should always do is, when a philosopher asks the question, how is it possible that P? How is this possible? What kind of a thing is this? Explain this. This needs explanation. I think what a philosopher should do is kind of gather themselves and ask whether, as it were, what they've been presented with has the credentials to actually require philosophical theorizing, right? And so one of the things that I did, I think, rather imperfectly in this book was what I tried to say was the idea of musical meaning only becomes terribly hard to understand and terribly difficult and paradoxical if we're working unthinkingly with a certain model about what meaning would have to be, which is roughly, linguistic meaning, Frege, grasping thoughts, that kind of thing. And that, once we sort of realize that the meaning of a work is just what's there to be understood in it, that might be a kind of, a way of us sort of loosening the grip that particular model of meaning has on us, so that we can see musical meaning for what it is, and in fact not be terribly puzzled by it. That's one of the things I was trying to do, and I think I probably made a bit of a hash of it, but that was what I was trying. That was what I was trying to do.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this discussion. Thank you.
There is a follow-up by Michael, I think. No more. Okay. Okay. Well, I found the book very useful because I think it's the first attempt to somehow outline this kind of normative implications in the music practice. I don't know if there are other books who do this, but I think that there aren't. So this puts a lot of order in the way that the issue has been treated all along. So I found it really useful.
That's very common. Yeah. Just before Michael comes in, I think that what I'd like to put on record here is how grateful I am to Peter Kivy, because I do think that Peter had this great insight that he developed in the wrong way, but I do think that he did much actually to make philosophers and musicologists think hard about authenticity.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful for
yeah, for sure. But you add a piece, somehow you reorder the stuff, to me it makes a lot of sense. Truly,
it's true. That's the point, Michael. Peter was a scary guy, right? And he was, he could be a bit cantankerous, and I was always quite in awe of him. And I was, I've been working away, and I was in the bar at a conference, and I saw him come over, and he had a kind of, oh God, because he had the reputation for being a little bit testy with people, and he just came over and said, very unexpected, he said, I just want to say how much I admire your work. And it was such a surprise and such a sweet thing for him to say. And I think perhaps we should do a bit more of that, particularly now.
Mm. That's very true.
Yeah, but he really did get the ball rolling on this topic.
Yeah. And Michael, maybe now, and then Elisa has another question.
Well, this was, in fact, just another bit. I sort of what you were saying, Lisa, I think really is just, it seems to me that what I mean, you can disagree with how it goes, and you may think it doesn't reflect the actual way that musicians think. I don't know, but it does seem that there's clearly something that Julian is addressing, which reflects demands that musicians do feel themselves facing. And obviously, I think it's really, really obvious in the chapter and the section here about the historicizing conception of score compliance. I mean, there's also the whole business of score compliance and how that fits in. And I think it's really actually helpful for a philosopher to come in and try and say, well, what kinds of values are there? I mean, there's contrast between constitutive values and sort of consequentialist values and things of that sort. And I think, in a way, it actually can allow a practicing musician a bit of freedom to step away from what can sometimes be a kind of imperialism of a particular fashion of interpretation, as I think the sort of historical authenticity movement was for a bit.
That's really interesting. I think that's a really good point. And one of the things that got me started on this was, reading the quote from Stephen towards the end, where he kind of throws his hands in the air at the idea of somebody deliberately, not following the score when they could. And I thought, and it was as if it was this sense that anybody doing that would have to be frivolous or just stupid, not understanding what they were doing. And that's plainly not the case. Musicians think really hard about these kinds of decisions. I mean, just talking to musician friends, they just do. I'm gonna depart from the score here, and it's not for the sake of interestingness, or because in some sense it sounds better to them, whatever that means. They think they're doing the right thing. They're being true to the work. They're bringing something out that's important. And the idea that it's just frivolousness was kind of what got me going. Carrie-Anne wasn't a frivolous sort of person. Yeah. No, thanks, Michael.
Elisa, maybe you want to ask your question?
Yes, I have all sorts of weird questions today.
The weirder the better.
So when you first introduced the topic of interpretive authenticity in the talk, and you said that it is about seeing the point of the work, I was immediately reminded of a talk by Noel Carroll that I attended a couple of months ago, where he was reformulating thoughts that he has already put forward in previous work, and he was making this claim that basically for him art appreciation is essentially about grasping a work's constitutive purpose, and that sounds very much like you're seeing the point of the work to me. And so starting from this observation, I was considering whether you would be willing to extend your view of what the interpreter of a musical work, of a classical musical work does, to art appreciation in general. So the work of the interpreter would simply be like a paradigm of art appreciation. And then if you are willing to to subscribe to this view of art appreciation. Then what happens with the appreciation of works of classical music? So is it simply about, I don't know, being as focused as possible on what the performer is doing in order not to project anything more on you know, on what we are orally grasping? Or is it like a sort of meta getting the work's constitutive purpose? So you have to get the work's constitutive purpose by getting the performance's constitutive purpose, or something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
sorry, this is a bit confusing.
No, this is all really good stuff. I mean, the first part of what you said, I do think that we've got something general here. And one of the things that really influenced me, and I'm going to recommend a paper now by David Bell called The Art of Judgment. It's an absolute crackerjack of a paper. I mean, 1989, Mind. When I was back at Manchester, we had a course for undergraduates, one module, as it were, which was, I wanted to call 80s classics, but I wasn't allowed. It was landmark papers in analytic philosophy, and mine was the David Bell paper. And he describes what it's like to finally be able to get your head around a Jackson Pollock, around Lavender Mist. And he who says, finally, all these things that look disparate suddenly seem to fall into place, and there's a sense of the integrity of the whole. He kind of slightly holds back from saying that that's a way of, that's kind of understanding. He kind of says something like, if you want to talk about understanding here, then that's sort of what it's going to be. It's kind of amazing with his pipe, you know. But it's a really great paper. So I think it does generalize the point. And then, you know, as audience members or readers, we're going to be better or worse at understanding works in different media. We're more familiar with them. That's going to be the big difference. You know, someone like, I mean, Michael is very musical. You know, he will, yeah, yeah, you know, so you know, so he's very adept in interpreting works in that medium. And then, yeah, of course. So how, and then, but you know, and other people, you know, I mean, you know, other people, you know, more familiar with photography or fiction, whatever. You know, you've got familiarity with the, you know, with the medium, and as it were, what happens when the medium's put together in that way? How is meaning generated? Because of course, you know, the meaning of the work is determined by what the artist does with the medium, and often they're not always totally in control of the medium, are they? But anyway, then there's a question of how do you go about figuring out whether a performance is really an insightful one of the work? Well, you know, you've got to be, I mean, there's going to be an element of bootstrapping here, because one's access to the work is going to be via other performances. As you know, most of us don't sit there in the concert hall with a score, and most of us who do are just very annoying, right? So there is a kind of bootstrapping thing, you know, so we'll, you know, listen to a lot of recordings of late Beethoven piano sonatas. And after a while, through that, you get a sense of what matters, what you think matters for this music. And one will prefer certain performances over others. One will regard them as more insightful, as bringing out more that matters. All the while being aware that one's conception of what matters is fallible and might develop as you hear more and as you talk to more people. You might change your mind. But yeah, that's kind of what happens. Yeah, but I think I think the point is that it does generalize, yes. And somewhere else where you find this thought is in Nehemiah. I always forget the title. Only a something. Oh God, you know what it is? It's a great book.
Yeah.
Promesse de Monnaie, isn't it?
It's
No, there's happiness in the
Promise of
title as well,
happiness.
right?
yeah.
Only
Hang on a minute.
happiness.
Hang on a minute.
Like that, yeah.
Stunde.
Hang on. Only a promise of happiness. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not going to see it very well. There.
Yes, yes, I remember that.
He makes the same point about theatre. He says the first thing you do when these people walk on the stage is try and figure out what the point of all this is. And there's a lot of very suggestive remarks about artistic meaning as well that I think are really interesting, about its limitlessness.
Yeah, but
it's like.
May I just say one thing?
Yeah.
But in terms of the kind of attention and what we have to do in order to appropriately grasp a certain performance of the work of music.
Yeah.
So is it like really, you know, paying attention to what is going on while trying not to, you know, use other information, while avoiding cognitive penetration, something like that? Because there is this person who is doing the interpreting for us, in a sense.
Yeah.
And so in part it looks like it's that, but in part it also looks like, no, we should be comparing the performance while we are listening to it to other performances of the same music, of the same piece of music we know. Or should we do it later on? Is it like an intellectual form of, like, do we go back to the work later?
That can happen. Sometimes, I mean, it can happen that you go to a performance of a work and it's just kind of so surprising and bizarre that you can't really get your head around it at first. And it takes some time to think it, to kind of internalize it and see what was going on. It can take some time. I mean, it was you, I think it was you, Michael, who introduced me to that Carlos Kleiber conducted performance of Beethoven's Six. Do you remember the end?
Yes.
So it's an astonishingly kind of vivid, clear, I mean, you know, brisk, a lot of kind of, you know, a lot of tempo variation, really, really vivid. It kind of, and it finishes and it's a live recording and the audience is just kind of stunned. and they're silent for quite a while, and then a few people start clapping, and then it builds and builds and builds, and then everyone's going berserk. I can imagine that taking a longer period of time, for sure. But I mean, as you're listening, you know, you know what work is being performed. If you're in a good position to, I mean, being in a good position to assess the performance will typically require one to have heard other performances. Yeah, that will really help. Yeah.
No, I just suspect that.
But all that will be in the background.
Yeah. I just suspect that this view that while listening to a performance, we have also to pay attention to the individuality, to the peculiarity of the performer, is very present, and it is something that is at odds with the view you have put forward. So I
don't think so, because I think that we're hearing the individual style of the performer for sure. I mean, you know, if you've listened to Glenn Gould's recordings of those late Beethoven piano sonatas, I mean, flipping heck, I mean, you can't but notice what's going on. But you're listening to it as an interpretation of those works or that work. That's not very difficult. It's not distracting. One's just listening to the performance for what it is. Do you see what I mean? I mean, you know, and as you're listening to those particular performances, one will think, has he got a train to catch? for example, you know, I mean, I mean, there's definitely something weird going on.
Mm-hmm.
Is he trying to show us that these are bad works? There's an element of that. I mean, but you know, anyway, that's just that particular case. But I don't think it's very difficult.
Mm.
You know, so yeah, you know, I mean, you definitely hear, you know, so when Uchida is playing Mozart, you definitely hear just that feathery lightness of touch. That's definitely her, and you hear this as an Uchida performance, but you're hearing it as a performance of that work and what she's trying, and you understand that what she's trying to do is to make sense of that work for us.
Yeah, I get all this. I
like watching a play.
Since it's for the very
sorry for interrupting. I think Jane had a question like
sorry.
ago. Maybe we have just a few minutes. Yeah.
Okay. It's partly in your reply, a comment on what you said, Elisa. I've always found it very interesting. When I go to concerts, I'm very often very analytical. I might apply philosophical things like we talk about, or sometimes I approach it from, I'm a pianist, I approach it from a very technical musical position. But what I'm always really intrigued about is in a really, really good performance, all of that analysis and everything else seems to just go out the window, and I find myself intently listening to the work. And I've often thought a sign of a good performance for me is if it makes me forget all the knowledge I bring to it, and I just enter totally into the actual music. And I always think that is really quite wonderful. So I wondered, Julian, or indeed Michael, if you have, if you agree with me, do you think there is something to that? Or I'm replying to what you were saying, Julian, about, you compare it to other works, maybe, but at the time, I think a great performance makes you go right into the music. Yeah. And there you are. And then afterwards, you can certainly do a lot of comparisons. But once you're there, I think you're there.
I think what happens is that if you're familiar with a work and how it's been performed, then you listen to a new performance in a concert hall and all that stuff's in the background. Yeah. Like, so for example, I can't listen. I mean, I can't listen to Sibelius 5. I just have, without, as it were, the Halle recording conducted by Barbaroli being there. So and when I listen to that particular recording, the phenomenology you've described sounds absolutely right. Oh, I'm at home. Yeah. This works for me. And I remember there's this wonderful program on Radio 3 on a Saturday morning, Building a Library. And what they do is they take one particular work and an expert talks us through all those gazillion recordings and eventually chooses 2 or 3 favorite ones, And I remember one week it was Sibelius 5 and I was just listening to it. Oh my God, no. It was just me thinking that, I just like how the Halle did it. And I couldn't hear the other performances of it without having the Halle kind of performance sort of right here. But your sense of what the work is got by listening to performances of it. That's the crucial point.
Yeah.
Yeah. This has been very good. Yeah.
Okay, I think it's 7 p.m. So I think, I don't know, we can go on, but maybe you're all tired and we're gonna have some Friday evening.
It's been a very, very nice occasion for me.
Yeah, I hope we can meet in Rome for real, like, in person and have dinner together.
If anybody wants to invite me to Italy at any time, please.
And you don't want to come? Why not?
Feel free. I'm there. I've got many skills. I can make tea. I can sweep the floor. I'll do anything.
Okay, then you're mostly welcome to visit us in Rome. Really, let's hope it will happen soon. Like,
yeah.
Next month.
Let's all hope that we can see each other soon in person.
Yeah, or in Montreal for those who are
those of you
going
coming
to be there.
Montreal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I stopped the